Welcome everybody to QAE at 25 podcast, and we're really looking forward to the discussion today on using credit for learners. My name is Dr. Ailsa Crum. I'm Director of Membership, Quality Enhancement and Standards at QAE, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by three colleagues today. First, Sue, can I ask you to introduce yourself? Sue is going to be chairing our session today. Sue.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to be here. My name's Professor Sue Rigby. I'm the Vice Chancellor at Bath Spa University and I'm a board member of the Quality Assurance Agency.
Thanks, Sue. And next we have Ruth.
Hello everyone, great to be here. I'm Professor Ruth Whittaker. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor Education and Students at the University of Brighton, and I'm currently chairing the revision of the National RPL framework in Scotland for the QAA.
So sorry.
Thanks very much, Ruth. There's always extra people trying to get into a podcast. You've no idea. We've sometimes got to put doors on automatic and cross-check them. And so we're also joined today by Claire. Claire, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Elsa. I'm Professor Claire Milsom. I'm currently the Interim Registrar and the Chief Operating Officer at Liverpool John Moores University. And I was really lucky to be part of the advisory group that Sue chaired.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those introductions. And I'm now going to hand over to our chair for today. So, Sue.
Thanks very much, Elsa, and we might bring you back into the conversation as it progresses. I can't think of a more fascinating topic than credit and credit transfer, but just in case there's anyone out there who can, we shall of course try to include the names of at least 4 dogs, 6 counties and 3 football players in the course of the next 20 or 30 minutes. But Claire, turning to you first, you were part of the revision of the credit framework for England last year. I wonder if you could share some of your experiences of working on that advisory group and just reflect on what that work has permitted that might have been more difficult before it was finished.
So yes, it was a real experience to be part of that group. It was a very eclectic group, so it included academics and quality managers and advisors across the whole range of higher education provision. So it included very small specialist providers, institutions like my own, very large complex institutions that have a high volume of collaborative provision as well, working across all the levels. And so initial conversations really sort of focused on the diversity of application and how would we present credit collectively across that very diverse range. And I think those conversations led to the positioning of the credit in the way we have in these 2 documents, so that we produce the kind of the advice, but also how to make credit work. And I think that those very early conversations made us realize there wasn't like one volume, but there were almost like 2 missions. It's like making it work within that particular institution, and it is still a regulatory framework that we all comply with, and that's what gives it the credibility and the robustness. So I think separating those and also looking at the position of different learners. We have our apprenticeships now, as well as students, as well as our professional practitioners. So it was like positioning that credit to a whole range of learners and making it work within those providers. But I think it was the richness of the group that gave us that insight and the ability to partition the credit in that way. Is that okay?
That's really interesting, and I think that idea of separating out how to use this, what's effectively a base code for designing degrees, from examples of good practice and so on, should be really, really useful going forward, and particularly as we go into a really uncertain future environment with the lifelong loan entitlement and so on. Perhaps we can pick that up between the 4 of us as our podcast goes on. But I mean, Ruth, you obviously have a leadership role in a credit framework using institution. How does that credit work for you, and how does it facilitate those kind of learner journeys that we're all so interested in?
Well, I think what's interesting is when we're looking at what's often described as kind of non-standard provisions are not our core provision. And I think that's really, such a growing agenda, isn't it, within the sector, but both actually within Scotland and the English sector, and indeed the rest of the UK, in terms of, alternative forms of kind of accessing and engaging with higher education, whether that's through degree apprenticeships, now through higher technical qualifications as well. And I think, Sue, as you said, this is a very live debate right now in terms of thinking about the lifelong loan entitlement and the policy commitment around a more flexible credit-based system that really does facilitate lifelong learning. So, and I think credit is, as you say, the currency that learners need to progress and navigate their way through that quite complex system now. I think it's important that we find ways of being able to enable learners to really understand how they can use that credit. I think that information, advice and guidance process is quite clear, because we're going to be supporting learners to obviously accumulate credit through a number of different routes now potentially. So we need to think about that at the point of curriculum design. So we really are facilitating multiple modes, if you like, of achieving, whether it's a modular qualification, how that might build up into an exit qualification, either at the institution that they're initially at, or indeed, of course, another institution. So I think actually credit is an incredibly exciting agenda in that sense, because it really does open up the possibility for learners from a much broader range of backgrounds, in the workplace, not in the workplace, coming from school or being out of education for many, many years, to kind of access higher education in much more diverse and creative ways than be possible before. So, and credit, I think, is at the heart of that process in terms of making that work.
I wonder what both of you think about whether credit looks different when it's chunked into 120 credit units for a year of study, and when it's one credit being 77 quid and aggregated together in lots of different ways. And I wonder if there's a way in which credit looks different depending on how you disaggregate it. Claire, can I start with you?
Yeah, and I think that those very early conversations with the advisory group, we all realised we had our own level of credit. So in my institution, it's around the module. That's how we think of credit, and we divide that up in CPDs, and then we aggregate modules together. But in other, with the degree apprenticeships, it was a very different model of positioning credit. So I think that I think you're absolutely right. You see it in terms of the award, but I think those individual building blocks are absolutely critical. And I think what we've learned through the pandemic is how flexible that credit is. And we've even, on some of our professional NHS programs, we've had to reposition levels in order for students to be able to still engage with placement and so on. But it's credit that has enabled us to do that, because, as we described, it's that kind of currency. So as long as we can shift the currency around, we can still continue to deliver even in very aberrant, challenging circumstances. We could still deliver professional practice programs that required placement, and the reason we could do that was we could kind of mix and match the credit, but at the position of the award, they will still hold their value. So we're still protecting the quality and standards, but we're at the point of time delivering credit. And I think that was really obvious in the last couple of years, that we can deliver credit and almost our eye isn't so focused on the award. But perhaps previously it was all about the award, it's all about building up to this pinnacle that was the award. But I think we've seen far more flexible uses. We've seen people take leave of absence, come back to credit, different arrangements, different institutions. And I think that's worked. Credit's enabled that, and it's enabled higher education to keep going the last couple of years.
That's really interesting, because it's almost like seeing credit as what helped us to teach through the pandemic, when we weren't looking at whole qualifications.
Yeah, we were.
Months of study.
Exactly. We were just getting through, weren't we? We were just getting through in those particular delivery circumstances, and what remained constant was the kind of notional learning hours around credit. And if we could hold on to that, we could keep going. But you're right, Sue, I wasn't so much on the award, it was around just maintaining that engagement with higher education, and we did that through credit.
I think that's really interesting, because one of the things that I think we've been trying to do as a sector is to think about developing sort of learning outcomes that enable different ways in which they can be achieved. And of course, it's exactly what we had to do during the pandemic, because we had to find other ways that we enable our students at university to achieve the learning outcomes of their course both through the sorts of learning and teaching experiences they were having, which were different during the pandemic, and indeed through our assessment approaches as well, which we had to sort of shift and think quite creatively about in terms of the challenges that remote learning and assessment presented to us as institutions. So actually it did open the box a bit for us, I think, as institutions, and make us really challenge our assumptions about how we need to structure learning, how we need to deliver it, and how we can assess it. And I think it'd be important to keep hold of some of those really creative lessons, I think, that we learned through the pandemic in terms of more flexible ways of constructing the learning and teaching and assessment around the award of credit as we move forward, particularly in the discussions around more modular, flexible higher education, which is, of course, the very active discussions that we're engaged in now across the UK.
Yeah. I mean, Ruth, I wonder if you'd like to amplify that. If we weren't in a podcast, I'd say blag. How that might fit into a lifelong loan entitlement, where perhaps every 30 credit module has to be self-standing in a value. But as universities, we also want to be able to join those things up so that people don't go down a rabbit hole, they don't end up in a dead end,
exactly,
but have a curated journey that might lead them to a degree.
I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think a lot of the debate that we're having in the English sector is very much around, we just need to get the supply side sorted and then we'll be fine. But the demand side, while there is an employer demand side, there's also a learner demand side. And I do think it's important, as you say, Sue, that if we are looking at valuing learning that's in smaller chunks, if you like, in modular provision, we absolutely have to build in progression pathways for learners, students to take up if they choose to, and that may be immediately or it may be in a few years' time. We cannot allow dead ends, and I think credit is the way that we can avoid dead ends, because I don't think it's fair or appropriate to ask a student to take out a loan for a modular form of learning if there is no currency attached to that allows that to be portable or transferable in any way towards an exit qualification at some level, either within the institution that they gain the module in, or of course outside of that. And I do also think that credit has value for employers as well. Where they may not value the actual credits so much as they do, I think what employers value about credit is the integrity and the quality of the learning that represents for them in terms of driving forward their needs in terms of workforce development. So I think credit does have a value both for the learner and for the employer. And I do think, yes, you're absolutely right, we need to find a system, we need to kind of almost deconstruct, I guess, the higher education system to some extent to enable us to really realistically enable learners to build up and accumulate that credit in smaller modular size components that they can see very easily where that can take them. They can, in terms of progression pathways. I think that's crucial. We have the capacity to do it. It's called credit transfer and accumulation. And we've had that for years, but of course we don't use it extensively at the moment in all cases. And I think we are going to be required to really think about this as part of our mainstream processes now, rather than peripheral processes where only a few learners might engage with that. I think there's going to be much greater demand for more learners to make use of that credit transfer possibility for modular provision as we move forward.
Yeah, and I guess that links very, very neatly to the recognition of prior learning, because learners are going to come into these courses with a whole variety of past experience, some of which might actually speed their plough through the study, and some of which might be generically advantageous. And I know you've thought about this deeply at least twice in the Scottish context. Would you take us through your thinking and where it's going?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And I think it's if we're generally as a sector, and I'm meaning a sector across the UK, if we really want to develop more flexible, accessible pathways to higher education, then we do need to think about more flexible, accessible ways of recognising prior learning. And while I'm very immersed in RPL, I will kind of do a quick definition in case any listeners to the podcast aren't completely familiar with it. But by RPL, recognition of prior learning, what we mean there is the process of recognising learning that has its source in experience, and of course also previous formal or non-formal, informal learning context. And of course that's about knowledge and skills that are gained in school or college or university, and of course outside formal learning situations as well through life and work experiences. So RPL is about recognising the value of learning wherever it occurs, and it's generally used by universities either to enable an applicant to meet the programme entry requirements if they don't have the traditional entry requirements for entry, or to achieve credit towards a named award. So the work that I'm engaged in, working with colleagues in the Scottish sector with the QAA and an RPL expert group, is absolutely about refreshing and revising the national RPL handbook for higher education in Scotland. And that was first developed in 2014. So a lot's changed in the last 8 years within the sector. And so it's incredibly timely to refresh this, and particularly I think within the context of the Scottish Funding Council review of coherent provision and sustainability, and that's really focused on genuinely creating a more integrated, connected tertiary education and skills ecosystem. So RPL obviously sits very much, as you say, Sue, is located within that agenda. The work's part of linked very much to the flexible and accessible learning strand of the quality enhancement theme in Scotland, the resilient learning communities, and there are two elements of that. There's the recognition of prior learning and experience, and also the use of micro-credentials, so the discussion we've just been having, as a means of accessing higher education and potentially sort of stacking credit to achieve a higher education award. That the two agendas are very, very linked. But as I said, while this is being undertaken in the Scottish HE sector, it clearly has resonance for the discussion we're having currently within the English sector. I think what's interesting about the RPL prominence now is that it's very much being tied in policy terms to its role in terms of really facilitating workforce development, to supporting economic growth and lifelong learning, with a real focus both in Scotland and England, certainly, of meeting regional employer needs and sort of sector priority areas. And of course, the other big agenda for RPL is its capacity to really enable participation in higher education by a much wider, diverse range of learners. It's very much the wide participation element of RPL is still very much prominent in the Scottish policy context. But of course, the challenge is, where the hopes and dreams come here, is that agenda has never really fully been realised. So the very learners which RPL historically, particularly recognition of prior informal learning, has tried to target, are the very learners that are presented with barriers to engaging with it, in the sense that there is, in terms of the information that we have about it that's freely available, the guidance we can give, and the very practice that we engage in as universities, create barriers to higher education, which of course RPL is supposed to overcome. I think what's interesting is that the research and the work that's been going on in RPL for years really does point to the fact that RPL as a process can be really formative. It can be transformative for learners. It can build learner identity, self-confidence, and of course, really crucially, the academic skills to succeed in higher education, the actual process itself. But actually, and if we are going to actually then, really, draw upon the benefits of that, we have to make RPL a more accessible option. And the way we need to do that is to really challenge ourselves on how we frame and value learning that's coming from different sources outside of the formal learning context. Because, if you're learning through work or life, that's not unitized, it's not structured, it's not linear, it's sort of messy, it's highly contextualized. And yet what we ask people to do in an RPL process is to demonstrate that they've met the learning outcomes of a course that's predicated on that kind of linear unitized structured process, on a formal learning process. And it's just really challenging to do that. So I think we do need to find ways of reframing our use of learning outcomes to take a much broader conceptualization of how we might recognize that credit. I won't elaborate upon that right now, but obviously happy to provide, to go into that. But I do think that, that's why this work in Scotland that the QA leading is so crucial, because unless we get this part of the jigsaw right, this valuing of prior learning, particularly informal learning, we're never going to achieve this goal of flexible, accessible pathways to higher education.
I mean, Claire, your university, Liverpool John Moores, is an absolute beacon for widening participation. And I guess recognition of all sorts of prior learning, RPL, APL, and so on, is a key part of admissions there. What reflections do you have on that? It's a fascinating subject.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and what Sue says though, it isn't structured and it isn't linear and it is a little bit messy, and actually capturing that's really important. I think for us with widening participation, it's more about how we use credit across the range of different programs. So we have credit right from level 1 up to level 8 in our professional doctorate, and we also have articulation arrangements with other institutions, our relationship with EFI as well, in the way that we deliver credit. So we use credit in order to secure that transition into higher education. And also, I think what Ruth was describing there as well, like exiting, we have a number of credit does allow you to step off as well and out and come back in. So it does provide that very flexible but structured approach, recognizing that, you know, not just with widening participation, but those are students who are actually in almost full-time work, or who are also carers, or who have come from a break from study from a different institution and have moved back. I think the pandemic, again, I'm going to keep going on about the pandemic, but we're noticing that we have got a more diverse approach even to our own. We are widening participation. We don't do it, we are it. But I think what we're seeing is more diversity in that participative approach, and more and people wanting to participate in different ways in higher education. And again, it is through credit that we can enable this, moving through a 360 credit award, but not necessarily not through a condensed approach, through a 2-year degree, as well as extending it through to a more structured part-time approach. So I think that kind of the conversation about learning outcomes has been very, very evident in the last couple of years, because it's about meeting the learning outcomes, whereas before it was about the lecture, or it was about the field trip or the workshop or and I think, we have been continually having, well, does it meet the learning outcomes? That is the genuine question. That isn't just a quality assurance box to tick as we go through validation. That is genuinely what we're asking. And does the assessment assess the learning outcomes? Again, that's been a very genuine question over the last 2 years. And I think that, as Ruth says, we need to sort of take confidence from those conversations. That always was, credit was always about a learning outcome. That's what it was. It was always about learning. But actually, somehow, maybe perhaps in institutions like my own, it became more about how you deliver the module, or how the professional body wanted. Even the professional bodies have been really quite flexible during this period. And I think maybe we just need to capture that confidence and those conversations around what the learning outcome, what they really are expected to know, and how we can be confident that they've demonstrated that after a process of learning. And I think if we capture that a bit more, it's beyond widening participation, isn't it? It's like having that diversity within that participation.
Yeah, I think if I can come in there, I absolutely agree. Learning outcomes are both the enabler and the barrier when it comes to the recognition of credit, in the sense when I'm talking about prior informal learning there, because as I said before, I think if you're trying to match learning from informal learning, from life work experiences, to learning outcomes on a modular level that are predicated on a formal delivery model, it's quite hard to do that. So I do think that if we're going to make learning outcomes an enabler, we absolutely have to think about that at the curriculum design stage. So we're building in the capacity for learning outcomes to be demonstrated in a variety of different ways and through different modes of learning as you move forward. And I also think it is linked to the point you make there about assessment as well. Again, just to linger a bit on recognition of prior informal learning, traditionally, and probably still is the case actually, the mainstream way of assessing prior informal learning is through a portfolio, which is an incredibly lengthy and resource intensive process, and often requires people to jump through more hoops to demonstrate learning outcomes that you might expect in a traditional route. And I do think that partly that's because we are trying to demonstrate this exact match at a modular learning outcome level, which I do think means that there is a value in looking at other ways of thinking about how we're going to frame that learning, first of all, in terms of outcomes. So perhaps looking at course level outcomes or level descriptors, which, enable that sort of broader articulation of the learning that's being achieved. It's a bit more easy to see how you can demonstrate learning at that level, a higher level, if you like, from a variety of different sources and routes. And And I think, thinking about, other forms of assessment, so using e-portfolios that enable that much more structured, iterative process to support evidence gathering, being more confident about using sort of artifacts that are derived from the workplace. So things that people have actually done at work, using that as evidence rather than asking just to write about what they've done at work. And of course, the greater use of sort of more structured interviews, professional interviews, as the primary or even single source of credit. So then we can think more flexibly about assessment, and we've had to think about more flexibly about assessment, as you say, during the pandemic, and indeed more authentic forms of assessment, which is also open and inclusive as well, which has also been a key feature, I think, of the work we've been engaged in at the university. But as I say, fundamentally, I do think we need to think about this now at the point of programme design rather than delivery, and rather than trying to retrofit learning that doesn't look familiar to us, or is packaged in a modular way that doesn't fit neatly within the course or the exit qualification that someone's trying to seek credit against. I think we do need to challenge ourselves about how we recognise and value that learning, and the assessment process that we engage in, which I do think, you're right, has parallels across other, not just in terms of one anticipation, but actually for all learners, for all students. They can all benefit from this more flexible, accessible approach to how we value people's learning through the award of credit.
In a way, Ruth, does that mean that if the learner was much more aware of those large, significant learning outcomes, they would be better able to personalise their learner journey because they know what they're aiming at? Sometimes I feel like a degree is a little bit like throwing darts at a dartboard when you're blindfold, and then afterwards you get this great reveal and find you didn't do most terribly well.
I think it does. I think it gives learners much more agency, because it enables them to, first of all, to make sure that we're actually recognising learning, which is important to them, but perhaps doesn't fit neatly into how we would define learning that should be valued. But it gives them more agency about how they can articulate that learning and see the bigger picture. And I think, when you think about, when we're looking at RPL for the purposes of giving someone, advanced standing or credit within a programme, what we're actually looking for is confidence that that individual has got the prerequisites, has the potential and the prerequisite knowledge and skills that they need to come onto the programme at a high level. Now, they don't need to do that by an exact modular learning outcome by modular learning outcome process. If we can get them to sort of support them through a process of how does their learning map on, as you say, Sue, to that higher level expression of learning outcomes at a course level, well, that should give us the confidence they can come in at that level and succeed. So I think we do need to be more confident about, valuing learning from other sources. And I think we are more confident as a sector. We certainly are. But I still think there's a way to go. And we're going to be really tested, I think, through all these, through the current sort of policy drivers linked to more modular or micro-credentialed learning, where we're going to be trying to make sense of learning that's packaged up differently and in smaller chunks and comes from a variety of different places. And we have to, as you say, build that into a coherent course for a learner. But I think, I think learners understanding ultimately what the course level learning outcomes are is going to give them a greater sense of how they can get there at the end and how we can support them through that process more effectively.
I mean, it strikes me that the other challenge in a very international higher education context is how credit works when it interfaces with different nationalities, different qualifications, and for example, the very different ways of understanding the attainment of learning that you get in Europe and way beyond. I mean, Claire, I know your university has a very significant reach internationally. What challenges and barriers and solutions does credit provide in that context?
I mean, we're, in terms of like articulation agreements and top-up programs, which are, one of the outcomes of a very healthy credit framework is that you can offer this, is that you have to be very secure around the mapping, even around the mapping between England and Scotland. It's not, you don't have to be fully international to be mapping across levels and frameworks. So I think that I think the discussions that we've had and the way we've presented credit within the QAA guidance and advice, I think it's about ensuring that there's clarity, there's a clear structural basis for that credit, and that does transcend kind of national barriers, and that we are very transparent in how the course is designed and how the level is positioned and structured. And I think that, you know, through doing that, there is consistency in the way in which education is delivered. But I think that when you start to look at a national context, you are very level focused, you know, on the level. So we've talked about module learning outcomes, but I think once you start to look at collaborative provision internationally, then it's the level learning outcomes. And again, you know, this was very much the discussion that we had within the advisory group, and in the advice document we have put sections around different level indicators, because understanding what level 4, 5, you know, it's complex enough, but how that progresses through is really important. And I think, again, perhaps those conversations about what we expect at the end, at a particular, not at the end of the level, but at a module positioned at a certain level, is quite critical. And then I'm going to have to refer to the pandemic again, but we had to move levels around, which is really, that's really bad credit practice, really. But in order to secure ultimate award outcomes for our students in professional practice, and to make sure that they had the placement opportunities, we did it. And you know what, it's okay. So maybe we can have less rigid level discussions with our international colleagues. Maybe we can look at how we position credit between levels as well. That's what I would say. It does move from a module discussion, program discussion, a level discussion, and then to a program discussion. And that bit in the level discussion is perhaps the one we don't have often enough.
Yeah, I would agree, Claire. I think that is absolutely crucial. So I think the use of level descriptors is really a game changer. When the work in Scotland is very much centred on the Scottish Credit Qualifications Framework, which has the advantage of being a national credit framework, of course, which includes all national qualifications at secondary and tertiary level across the vocational and academic domains. But of course, we've got the handy ready reckoner that obviously compares the SCQF to the other UK frameworks, and of course then the European qualifications framework as well. And I think there's been a lot of work, hasn't there, over the years to kind of use level descriptors, national and indeed international, where they exist, as that kind of mediation, that translation tool to really, to facilitate that kind of the award of credit, that recognition, that currency that means transferability, not just within a national sector, but also across national boundaries as well. And I think you're right, Claire. I think level descriptors are incredibly powerful if used effectively in that context. And I do think they give us the capability to recognise learning that's coming from lots of different places, including internationally as well. Because that's who our learners will be. We will have global learners who will build up different learning experiences, whether that's formal learning or informal learning throughout their lives. And they're going to come to us with a package of learning, and personalised package of learning that we have to work with them to kind of help them, enable us to value and recognise that in a way that's meaningful and is going to enable them to progress in the direction they want to progress in, both educationally and in terms of their career, of course.
I think that level discussion is where probably it is quite powerful, because then you're moving into integrated masters, professional doctorates. So it's not, we tend to sort of see credit very positioned at that 360 undergraduate level, but the real capacity for international collaboration is at those higher level degrees. So if we can start to see more international collaboration around our integrated master, our professional doctorates, our research, our taught masters programs, that understanding of level 7 and 8, that's quite critical. And I think that if we have, the more conversations we have that, and the more shared understandings, and the more we articulate that, and this will be the last sort of plug I do for the advisory group's documentation, but there is a fabulous table in the advice that really does map all these across. And I think what it particularly does is just how long the list of qualifications around credit, and this is from the micro-credential right up to the professional doctorate, you can see how the credit aggregates, and how if you get the level mapping right, you don't have to be in one institution to go from your sort of level 3 foundation right to your professional doctorate. If it can be with you with your career or your lives or your, then you can see how credit at that level, positioned at the level, can really work. So yeah, I think I might have lost my way with that. But level's good in credit. To know the level in credit is good.
I think this has been a fascinating discussion, because I think what we've done is take something that is perhaps on paper quite abstract and quite theoretical, and we've explored the ways in which it had relevance for us during a pandemic when all of the standard teaching mechanisms were challenged, and it actually helped us to navigate that space. And there's an awful lot of learning that we can surface from that very traumatic process. It's also something that is clearly going to help the lifelong loan entitlement to work, drawing on what we already have, which is that means of navigating via credit from the beginning of an undergraduate degree and earlier, right through to the end of formal learning, wherever people choose that to be. I think what we've seen absolutely is that as that use of credit gets more imaginative, more people will want to jump on and jump off. So having the right ways of doing that through a really broad understanding of RPEL and APEL and so on is really going to facilitate that. And I think the other thing that we're starting to see is that although we present formal learning, it has to start to map more authentically onto the informal learning that is of value in a lifetime of informal study, and that those interfaces are actually both vital, authentic and exhilarating to enable learners to cross, and that crossing those boundaries can be at different times in an individual's life, or indeed they can be between different countries, different types of learning, different types of study setting, different types of negotiation with learning, be it online, face-to-face and so on, that employers can use this currency to help see the value of learning in smaller chunks, and that universities can see the value of credit as something that places learning outcomes into achievable entities that will really help to make that discourse with employers very live. So just as a kind of very brief essay, I mean, all of us in the room could carry on indefinitely, but I imagine some people are coming to the end of their run or the end of their journey home from work. Ailsa, I know that the QAA is providing increasingly high levels of support and enhancement for all of these different aspects of credit and standards and so on. I wonder if you'd like to kind of finish us off by just talking about the ways in which the QAA is helping in this discourse.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, I mean, we have the array of documentation that we've mentioned, and thanks, Claire, for giving a shout out to those excellent pieces. But what we want to do is not, have the credit framework sit, or indeed either or any of the credit frameworks, because there are a number of the different nations in the UK. And what we don't want is for them to sit as a sort of dry entity, but rather we want to open them up and to encourage colleagues to think about how they can be used and what they mean. So I think that opening up and contextualizing how credit can be used in a range of contexts is so important. So part of our function is to create short, practical resources that can be used by busy academics, by busy students, and we're accompanying that with a range of events where we can invite colleagues in to discuss and debate these ongoing topics. A really big part of our role, though, and I think a big part of the service we can provide for the sector, is in influencing, and we're really keen to do that with governments and sector bodies right across the UK to make sure that good decisions are made, that our practitioners are heard, that they are listened to by the policymakers, and that we arrive at sensible decisions around use of credit that will be to the advantage of high quality UK higher education and to our students, all of them, more traditional students and some of the newer students that we're looking forward to welcoming in.
Thanks very much, Ailsa. And I'll just finish off by thanking all of our participants. I'll try and do that in alphabetical order. Thank you to Ailsa Crum. Thank you to Claire Nelson. Thank you to Ruth Whittaker. Thank you to Claire's dog. And goodbye from me.